Okay. All right. Kia ora koutou. This is actually a little bit of a side project, but it falls a little bit under Better Start as well. A lot of my earlier research, particularly during my PhD, was interested in maternal and child health, particularly maternal health during pregnancy, and then how that affected child development. And so this sort of was a flow on from that. I was interested in looking at antidepressant use during pregnancy for women in New Zealand, and then the hopes to eventually actually look at how this relates to perhaps unmedicated depression during pregnancy and whether these have any effects on child development. So again, you're going to see that disclaimer. Won't go into it though. But in terms of depression, I'm sure as many of you know, it is a disorder characterized by depressed mood, loss of interest and enjoyment, and decreased energy, amongst other symptoms. The World Health Organization estimated prevalence is thought to be about 4.4% globally at a given time, with a sex difference apparent, where females tend to have a higher prevalence relative to males. It does seem to be exacerbated during major life events, such as pregnancy, with the pregnancy prevalence estimated to be between 7 to 13%. And this is sort of what has been found in New Zealand as well. The longitudinal Growing Up in New Zealand study found that almost 12% of women were over the threshold for experiencing gestational depression. So, one factor that can contribute to treatment are antidepressants, but fair enough, there are concerns about the risk to the child associated with taking antidepressants, but there's also concerns about the risk to the child, both to child and mother, with experiencing gestational depression as well. In terms of the research, there tends to be mixed findings. It's unclear sometimes whether the effect is due to the antidepressant or due to actually experiencing depression itself. And then even with outcomes associated with gestational depression, it's unclear whether it's that or also for child outcomes, the child also being exposed to later maternal mental health issues as well. So in terms of what has been looked at for outcomes associated with both depression during pregnancy and antidepressants, preterm birth and low birth weight have been associated with both. For depression, it's also been linked to sort of difficult temperaments, neurocognitive outcomes, later risk of behavior and behavioral problems and mental health problems in the child, as well as postpartum depression in the mum. And for antidepressants, a lot of the research has focused primarily on sort of more immediate or neonatal outcomes. So looking at congenital or birth abnormalities, including heart defects. Quite a bit of the research has looked at sort of heart defects in the child and also just general withdrawal symptoms. Some research has looked at sort of shorter term neurobehavioral effects related to things like attention in the infant, but there's not a lot that has been done in terms of longer term outcomes. So this is sort of especially when you're trying to look at antidepressant use compared to depression itself, it's not clear whether it's antidepressants that are linked to the later outcome versus just the underlying condition of maternal depression. Now, for some women, antidepressants may be particularly helpful in managing their symptoms. And obviously talk therapy is undoubtedly beneficial, but there may be some women that find it harder to access this relative to medication. There's a cost involved, there's time involved. So this can be tricky. And if for some people, medication might be a more helpful option, it's important to kind of weigh up the risk versus benefit for that. So I'm particularly interested then in kind of understanding that, and there's sort of three main aims for this. So the first one is to look at existing trends over time and across socio-demographic groups in antidepressant intake during pregnancy. So are we seeing any changes over time? Is it getting more prevalent? And are we seeing differences across socio-demographic groups, which might demonstrate potential issues with access? And then also I'm interested in looking at unmedicated depression. How prevalent is it? And does this vary across socio-demographic groups again? So are there many women essentially that are experiencing significant depressive symptoms that are not receiving medication? And then also, are there differences by socio-demographic groups, which again might further indicate if there are vulnerable groups that are having difficulties with access. And then finally, are the risks associated with gestational antidepressant intake greater than the risks associated with unmedicated depression? So are both associated with risks? Does the risk differ across the two? And for that, I'm interested in focusing on birth outcomes, but also longer term cognitive, behavioral, and mental health outcomes. So today I'll be talking about kind of what I've found in relation to the first aim, and then I'll talk a bit about how I kind of plan to address the next two after that. So for the first aim, looking at the trends over time and across groups, we use the integrated data infrastructure for that, and our sample consisted of all resident New Zealand women who gave birth, and this was done for each fiscal year between the 1st of July 2007 to the 30th of June 2018. So these women were identified via the DIA birth records and then linked to, so it would be the child's birth and then linked to the mother identified through that. And then most of the birth records have gestational age available as well. So you can back calculate what the approximate conception date is from that. And so those are just the random counts for each fiscal year of women who gave birth within those fiscal years. In terms of the antidepressants, so these were obtained from the Ministry of Health Community Pharmaceutical Collection, and there were 6 sort of broad classes of antidepressants that we looked at. So these were SSRIs, MAOIs, SNRIs, tricyclics, tetracyclics, and NASAs. I don't know if they're actually, I'm going to call them NASAs. So specifically, we got the count of women who received at least one dispensing of an antidepressant, and then we calculated the rate for each fiscal year just by having the count who received a dispensing as a numerator, with the denominator being the total number of resident pregnant women in New Zealand, and then calculate the rate per 1,000 women. So that was across pregnancy, but then we also looked at the prevalence for each trimester, and then so from when pregnancy conception approximately was to 3 months prior, the prevalence 3 months to 6 months prior, pre-pregnancy, and then for age groups, total response ethnicity, NZ-DEP area level quintiles, and we also looked at the prevalence of medication type. So in terms of the prevalence across pregnancy, you can see that there is a steady increase over the entire study period, with 36 per 1,000 women at the start of the study period, and increasing to 59 per 1,000 women at the end. In terms of dispensing prevalence from pre-pregnancy and through pregnancy, you can see that the rate pre-pregnancy is quite similar, regardless of whether it's 3 months or 6 months. There is a drop in the first trimester, with a further drop in the second trimester, with no real change in the third trimester. There appears to be sort of stable use in from the second to third trimesters. In terms of the prevalence by age, we're seeing that antidepressant intake is more prevalent in older women. So there is this age gradient where women that are 24 years or less have the lowest prevalence. And then in terms of dispensing prevalence by ethnicity, again, you can see that there's clear differences here, where the European and other groups have the highest prevalence, and other tends to be quite Eurocentric as well as a group, with Pacifica and Asian in particular having the lowest prevalence, with the Mila and Maori ethnicities in the middle. And then when looking at the prevalence by quintiles, you can see that the most deprived quintile has quite a notable lower prevalence in antidepressant dispensings, with no real difference between the other area level groups, deprivation groups. Then looking at the rate per 1,000 for the different medication types, SSRIs were by far the most prevalent medication, followed by, well, by the end of the study period, SNRIs and tricyclics were quite similar, but SNRIs did see quite an increase in prevalence over the study period, not as much as tricyclics, and MAOIs and tetracyclics were just not very prevalent at all, and we couldn't get the counts really because they were so low. So in terms of what our results are like in comparison to other countries, New Zealand is pretty much on par with what we're seeing internationally with other administrative, other studies that have used administrative data. So we're seeing an increased reliance on antidepressants during pregnancy, which is what has been found internationally as well. And then again, SSRIs are the most dominant antidepressant, which is again what has been observed, not just during pregnancy otherwise as well, but during pregnancy, the prevalence is about the same as what has been observed in other countries as well. We're similarly seeing a reduction in antidepressant dispensings during pregnancy, from pre-pregnancy through to trimester 2. And that decreased prevalence following trimester 1, which is similar again to what has been observed internationally. So to sum that up, what we're seeing really are that younger women and those from most deprived areas have the lowest dispensing prevalence. But interestingly, research has shown that younger age and low socioeconomic status are actually risk factors for experiencing gestational depression. So it could be that this lower dispensing prevalence may be reflecting barriers to accessing medication for these groups. We're also seeing the highest dispensing prevalence in New Zealand Europeans, even though research has shown that New Zealand Europeans are less likely to experience serious depressive symptoms or mood disorders during pregnancy relative to other ethnic groups. Again, this could reflect differences in access to healthcare, or it could be cultural differences in treatment choices and the perception of depression. It's worth noting that Bowden, so Nick Bowden that Barry mentioned actually, who also works with us with A Better Start, he has looked at antidepressant dispensings in New Zealand youth and has observed similar ethnic and deprivation differences in this group as well. So in terms of next steps, we're looking at unmedicated depression and then the risks associated with gestational antidepressants and unmedicated depression. Well, you must be wondering, the IDI, how do you identify people that are actually experiencing depression? It is based on service use. So it is kind of quite biased in terms of it'll include people that are actually accessing the services. And it's not that ideal for evaluating softer measures like symptoms, because again, there may be people in the population experiencing a high level of symptoms that will also not go and access any sort of services. And also there's no GP information, which is another source of getting that sort of mental health information. There's nothing in there in terms of the details of going to your GP, and that is probably where a lot of people with more moderate, mild to moderate mental health symptoms would be captured. So this sort of information does need to be supplemented with a data source that can provide this information. So something like representative surveys or longitudinal studies. So what I'll be doing is actually using data from the Growing Up in New Zealand study for the next 2 bits. And the first part of what I'll do is look at socio-demographic differences in antidepressant intake during pregnancy, just to see if they align with what we're seeing in the population. Following that, I'll be looking at what proportion are experiencing unmedicated depression in this cohort. They use the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, which is a screening tool for antenatal and postnatal depression. And they've published with this previously, where the studies also identified that younger mothers, non-European women, and those from low-income households are more likely to be experiencing depression in pregnancy. And then finally, I'll be looking at the risks associated with unmedicated depression compared to women on antidepressants in terms of those birth outcomes and a range of other later developmental outcomes. And if you're wondering what those are, so antenatally, I'll be focusing primarily on birth weight and preterm birth. There's behavioral measures at 2, 54 months or 4.5 years, and 8 years, some language measures and cognitive measures at both 4.5 and 8 years, as well as some more detailed mental health measures at 8 years as well. And just some final points. Obviously not everyone may want to be on medication, and I want to acknowledge that, and that it's up to individual preferences. And then again, that ethnic and cultural backgrounds may influence treatment choice. And also, this is not to diminish the massive importance of talk therapy, but as I said, this might be an expensive and difficult to access option, particularly in the long term for some women. So really, the hope is that this might inform treatment options for women who find antidepressants helpful, but are concerned about the risks associated with it for their child. And finally, I just want to thank Charlotte Svardal, who was a summer student that did some of the IDI work on this and is continuing to work on this with the Growing Up data as an undergrad research project. Karen Waldy, who's a co-investigator and based at the University of Auckland School of Psychology, who is part of the Growing Up team. A Better Start, National Science Challenge team, the Public Policy Institute for letting us use their data lab, and obviously Stats New Zealand for their access to the IDI. And thank you. Any questions? Yeah. In the population, you mean? Yeah. Yes, I think I will. I kind of haven't, I want to look at what we can look at. It's a bit tricky with the IDI again, because I guess what we can look at is only antidepressants versus not antidepressants. So it's not getting at that unmedicated depressed group. But I think it'll still be interesting to look at to see if we're finding anything in the population, and then kind of further exploring that with the Growing Up in New Zealand data to kind of tease apart the effect of antidepressants versus depression. Yeah. But I think I kind of need to look into this a bit more, and I want to also look, one benefit with the IDI is that we can look at specific medication types, whereas it's just a broad question with Growing Up in New Zealand. So I want to look a bit more into, because there's been a bit published recently, but again, it's conflicting, but looking into what medications specifically are, because there's some SSRIs that are risky, not all SSRIs, or have been linked to outcomes. So just kind of looking into that a bit more as well. Yeah.
There's like non-pharmaceutical mental health. Is the concern not being able to like narrow it down to just depression in particular?
Yeah. There's that, and then also just because I think that will capture a very extreme group as well, that are, because it's mostly inpatient. Is that right, Barry? Or is it? Oh, yeah.
One, there's a lot of unmet need. So a lot of people want to use the services. And then there's also that it's not the same as us being represented some of the population. Depression screening, like you get a good sense of
Yeah.
Who's getting medicated and how it feels about how it.
Yeah.
But there is that there. So next time work on that, right? Don't neglect this.
Yeah, I think that's the reason I probably, because I think we did discuss it and he mentioned that it's hard to figure out what exactly they're getting treatment for. Yeah. There, you could potentially link up and see women who are getting antidepressants plus getting mental health, non-pharmaceutical treatment. That could be something. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Are you looking at the same chronic or function?
You mean, am I looking at long-term use and like postnatally as well?
Yeah. Or I mean, also those pregnant women who have several children, then taking them.
So that can be done easily with not necessarily antidepressants with the growing up data. You can adjust for postnatal mental health because they've taken, they've measured maternal mental health at each data collection wave. And you can look at sort of previous pregnancies as well. In terms of, it is possible with the IDI too, but I guess the question is whether it's medication again versus what you're experiencing, having a child exposed to sort of a mum who's unwell. But I think the kind of theory behind it is the intrauterine exposure and whether that is affecting development and brain development in any way. So I think there's ways to control for it. It'll need probably a little bit of thinking around how that could be done. Are you thinking of like sibling analyses maybe specifically? No, not at the moment, but it's something to think about. First dispensing related to... right. It's just the dispensing during pregnancy. So have not looked at chronic antidepressant intake, but it is something that could be looked at. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
What about dispensing after birth?
Mm.
And whether that then bounces back up to your pre-birth levels or not?
Oh, in terms of, I can actually look at that. I haven't looked at that yet. And I did think about that, just to see if the rate does increase. Yeah, that could certainly be something that's worth looking at. I think that from my understanding, it is safe. It's okay to take antidepressants, most antidepressants during while breastfeeding. So I think that...
I guess it's just that idea of perception and potentially people stopping and if you see that it's at the same level before and after. Well, I mean, there's obviously lots of different things in pregnancy, but if there is likely to have been a leak there.
Yeah, and it's also interesting then to see if that might link up to postpartum experiences too. Yeah. Any other questions? If not, I think we're still a bit early. Oh, Barry, all right. Yeah.
The data you've got, you actually look at trajectories of antidepressants 5 years pre-pregnancy to 5 years post-pregnancy.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing is a dip that increase a little bit first and then definitely second and third. But you don't actually know when it comes back up again. I think
That would be so interesting. I wish I could merge them to give like, yeah, but also just like it would be interesting for child outcomes as well, because that's kind of my little pet interest, and if this actually makes a difference or if it matters for children, because if it doesn't in the long term, then it's better that women are able to look after their health. Yeah, I'm gonna go scribble stuff down after this.
If they go back on, it's because they're actually struggling.
Yeah.
That's the indication that maybe affecting children.
Yeah.
That's actually a good thing.
Well, I suspect that's a lot of the time that would be the case, because you would just go back on for management, not just because if your symptoms are fine, like and you feel like they're under control, then you wouldn't feel the need to go back on medication, I suppose. Yeah. Any other thoughts? That wasn't really a question, Barry. It was just a comment, wasn't it?